3,000 feet above New York City, both engines went silent. Captain Chesley Sullenberger gripped the sidestick. First Officer Jeffrey Skiles stared at the instrument panel. Behind them, 150 passengers felt the aircraft shudder. Then came the smell: burning birds, burning metal. The kind of smell that means something went terribly wrong. The Airbus A320 was 3 minutes into its flight. It was supposed to be in the air for 2 hours. Instead, it had maybe 3 minutes left, maybe less. Sullenberger keyed the radio. Mayday, mayday. Nobody on board knew it yet, but the plane was already falling. US Airways Flight 1549 pushed back from Gate 8 at LaGuardia Airport at 3:03 p.m. on January 15, 2009. It was a Thursday afternoon. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Ice clung to the edges of the Hudson River a mile to the west. Inside the cabin, 150 passengers settled into their seats. Some were headed home to Charlotte, North Carolina. Others had connections to cities farther south and west. It was the kind of routine domestic flight that happens thousands of times a day across America. At the controls sat 2 experienced pilots. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, Sully to almost everyone, had logged more than 19,000 flight hours over 4 decades. He was 58 years old, methodical, quiet. He'd been a fighter pilot, a safety consultant, an instructor. First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, 49, had flown for 23 years. This was his first flight in the A320 after transitioning from the Boeing 737. Sullenberger was the pilot monitoring. Skiles was flying the aircraft. Behind the cockpit door, 3 flight attendants prepared the cabin. Donna Dent, Doreen Welsh, Sheila Dale. They'd done this hundreds of times. Safety demo, seat belts, tray tables, the rhythm of commercial aviation. The aircraft, an Airbus A320-214, registration number N106US, was 16 years old. It had flown tens of thousands of hours. Its maintenance record was clean. Both engines, CFM56 turbofans, were operating normally. There was nothing in the logbook that suggested trouble. At 3:24 p.m., air traffic control cleared Flight 1549 for takeoff from runway 4. Skiles advanced the throttles. The Airbus accelerated down the pavement, lifted off, and climbed into the cold gray sky over Queens. Everything was normal. Skiles held the climb. The aircraft tracked northwest following the standard departure procedure. Sullenberger monitored the instruments. Airspeed, altitude, heading, all where they should be. The flight attendants started moving through the cabin. Passengers opened magazines, checked phones, closed their eyes. 1 minute after takeoff, the A320 passed through 2,000 feet. 2 minutes in, it reached 2,800 feet. The skyline of Manhattan stretched out to the left. The George Washington Bridge hung in the distance ahead. The river below looked gray and cold. Skiles and Sullenberger were talking through the climb checklist when the birds hit. 3:27 p.m. Flight 1549 flew into a flock of Canada geese. The birds struck both engines almost simultaneously. Passengers in the window seats saw dark shapes, then flashes, then smoke. The noise was immense, a series of thuds and bangs that echoed through the fuselage. The left engine exploded first. Metal tore. Fire shot out the back. Seconds later, the right engine followed. In the cockpit, warning lights flooded the panel. The engine displays showed catastrophic failure. Both N1 readings, engine speed collapsed. Thrust dropped to nothing. The stick shaker activated. The aircraft was no longer climbing. It was already beginning to fall. Sullenberger took control. "My aircraft." Skiles replied, "Your aircraft." Sullenberger nosed the plane down slightly to maintain airspeed. Without engines, the A320 was a glider. A very heavy, very fast-falling glider. He had maybe 3 minutes before it hit the ground. Maybe less. He keyed the radio. "Mayday, mayday, US Airways 1549, we've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia." Air traffic controller Patrick Harton heard the call. He immediately cleared other aircraft out of the way and offered runway 13 at LaGuardia for an emergency landing. Sullenberger turned the aircraft, but he was watching the altitude. They were at 3,000 feet. LaGuardia was behind them across urban Queens. Buildings, houses, streets full of people. He ran the numbers in his head. Glide ratio, distance, descent rate. He knew they weren't going to make it. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft bank. Some heard the engine noise cut out. Others noticed the unnatural quiet. Flight attendant Donna Dent smelled smoke. She moved toward the cockpit. Doreen Welsh started preparing passengers without knowing exactly what was happening. There was no time for a full announcement yet. In the cockpit, Harton offered Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, a smaller field closer to the west across the river. Runway 1 was available. Sullenberger considered it, but now they were at 1,700 feet. Teterboro was miles away. More buildings between them and the runway, more people on the ground. He made the call. "We can't do it. We're gonna be in the Hudson." It was 3:29 p.m. They had been in the air for 4.5 minutes. Harton acknowledged. There was nothing more he could do. Sullenberger's hands moved across the panel. He deployed the auxiliary power unit. He adjusted the pitch. He needed to keep the aircraft's nose up just enough to slow the descent, but not so much that the plane stalled and dropped like a stone. The balance was everything. Skiles pulled out the quick reference handbook and started running through the dual-engine failure checklist. It was written for pilots trying to restart engines at altitude. They had no altitude. They had no time. The checklist couldn't save them now. Sullenberger looked out the windscreen. The Hudson River stretched ahead. Ferries, boats, chunks of ice. The water was gray, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill in minutes, but it was flat. It was open. It was the only option. He turned to Skiles. "Got any ideas?" Skiles shook his head. "Actually not." Sullenberger keyed the intercom to the cabin. His voice was calm, flat, deliberate. "This is the captain. Brace for impact." Behind the cockpit door, the flight attendants began shouting. "Brace, brace, heads down, stay down." Passengers grabbed their knees. Some prayed. Some stared out the windows at the water rushing up. One passenger, Barry Leonard, later said he was certain he was about to die. Another, Jeff College, watched the river and thought about his family. Nobody screamed. The cabin was almost silent except for the attendants' voices. Sullenberger lined up the aircraft parallel to the river. He couldn't afford to hit the water at an angle. The plane would cartwheel and break apart. He had to land it flat, like putting down a huge, fragile piece of glass. The altitude readout ticked down. 1,000 feet, 500, 200. Sullenberger pulled back slightly on the side stick. The nose lifted just a few degrees. The A320's tail was low. Its wings were level. The river filled the windscreen. At 3:31 p.m., 208 seconds after the bird strike, US Airways Flight 1549 touched down on the Hudson River. The impact was violent. The fuselage slammed into the water at roughly 150 miles per hour. The force drove passengers forward against their seat belts. Overhead bins popped open. Carry-on bags flew. The tail struck first, then the rear of the fuselage. Water exploded upward. The aircraft skipped once, came down again, and slid forward across the surface. The belly tore open. Freezing river water poured into the cabin through cracks in the hull. Then the plane stopped. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then the flight attendants started yelling again. "Evacuate! Get out! Move! Move!" Water was already shin-deep in the back rows. Passengers unbuckled and stood. The aisles filled. The emergency exits, 4 over the wings, 2 doors at the front, 1 at the rear, were supposed to open quickly. But the rear door, submerged in water, couldn't be used. Doreen Welsh tried to open it and river water flooded in. She slammed it shut. That left 5 exits. Passengers scrambled onto the wings. The cold hit them immediately. Wind, spray, the smell of jet fuel. The wings were slippery. People grabbed each other to keep from falling into the river. Some were in business clothes, suits, ties, heels. Others in jeans and sneakers. A few had grabbed coats. Most had nothing. Flight attendant Sheila Dale stood on the left wing, pulling people out of the exit. Donna Dent worked the right side. Passengers helped each other. Strangers held hands. One man, Carl Bazarian, fell into the water and was pulled back up by others. Another passenger, Alberto Panero, clung to the wing and waited for rescue. Inside the cabin, Sullenberger and Skiles ran through the evacuation checklist. Engines already off. Fuel shut off. Electrical isolated. They grabbed the emergency equipment and moved through the plane, checking seats, checking bathrooms, checking every space to make sure no one was left behind. Sullenberger walked the cabin twice. Water was up to his chest in the back rows. The plane was sinking. He called out. No answer. He checked again. Finally, he and Skiles climbed out onto the wing. 155 people were out of the aircraft. All of them, not one left inside. Now they just had to survive the river. The rescue started within minutes. The first boats to reach the wreckage were New York waterway ferries. Captain Vince Lombardi, at the helm of the ferry Thomas Jefferson, saw the plane go down from across the river. He didn't wait for orders. He turned the boat and opened the throttles. By the time Flight 1549 stopped moving, Lombardi was already approaching. Other ferries followed. The Moira Smith, the Governor Thomas H. Keene, the Yogi Berra. 14 vessels in total from NY Waterway alone, plus Coast Guard boats, NYPD Harbor Patrol, Fire Department rescue boats. The Hudson River filled with flashing lights. Passengers stood on the wings, shivering. Some were waist-deep in water. The aircraft was tilting, the tail sinking lower. Ferry crews threw lines and life rings. Passengers grabbed them and pulled themselves toward the boats. Some climbed ladders. Others were hauled up by deckhands. One elderly woman, Adelaide Horton, 77 years old, stood on the wing in soaked clothing. A ferry pulled alongside and crew members lifted her aboard. She was hypothermic but alive. Ben Bostic, a software engineer, was one of the last off the wing. He later said he didn't think he'd survive the water, but the ferries kept coming. Sullenberger and Skiles stayed until every passenger was off. Then, finally, they climbed aboard a rescue boat. Sullenberger looked back at the sinking plane. The tail was underwater. The nose was tilted up. Within an hour, the entire aircraft would be submerged. By 4:00 p.m., all 155 people from Flight 1549 had been pulled out of the river. They were taken to hospitals, ferry terminals, warming centers across Manhattan and New Jersey. 5 people had serious injuries, broken bones, deep cuts, hypothermia. Dozens more had minor injuries, but no one died. Not one person died. The investigation began immediately. The National Transportation Safety Board dispatched a team to New York that night. They wanted the aircraft. They wanted the black boxes. They wanted to know exactly what happened and why everyone survived. Over the next weeks, divers recovered the plane from the riverbed. Both engines were retrieved and examined. Investigators found organic material, feathers, tissue, bone, inside the compressor sections of both turbofans. DNA testing confirmed it. Canada geese. The birds had been sucked into the engines at high speed, damaging the fan blades and compressor stages. The left engine was destroyed. The right engine was severely damaged and couldn't produce thrust. The NTSB pulled the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. They listened to every word Sullenberger and Skiles said in the final minutes. They analyzed every input on the controls. The data showed Sullenberger had flown the approach almost perfectly. His pitch, his speed, his angle of descent, all within a narrow margin that allowed the plane to survive impact. The board's final report, released in May 2010, concluded that the bird strike caused total loss of thrust in both engines. It also concluded that the decision to ditch in the Hudson, rather than attempt a return to LaGuardia or Teterboro, was correct. The crew's performance, the report said, was exceptional. The flight attendants' evacuation procedures saved lives. The quick response of the ferry crews and first responders saved lives. Everything had to go right. And somehow it did. Sullenberger and Skiles were hailed as heroes. They appeared on television, met the president, received awards. The Airbus A320 was eventually put on display at the Carolinas Aviation Museum in Charlotte. People could walk up and see the torn metal, the cracked windows, the water stains. But for the passengers, the story didn't end with the rescue. Some struggled for years with post-traumatic stress. Others said the experience changed them, made them appreciate life, family, the small moments. A few stayed in touch, formed a survivors group, met on anniversaries. They called themselves the Hudson River Survivors. And every January 15, they remembered. There are moments in history when everything should go wrong, when the odds are impossible, when the math says people die. US Airways Flight 1549 was one of those moments. A bird strike at the worst possible time. Both engines gone. No altitude. No airport in range. A freezing river in the middle of the largest city in America, but the plane didn't hit a building. It didn't crash in Queens. It didn't flip and break apart on impact. And 155 people walked away. Not because of luck, because of training, because of skill, because of one captain who had 4 decades of experience and 3 minutes to use it, because of a first officer who stayed calm when everything went to hell, because of flight attendants who kept passengers moving when the water was rising, because of ferry captains who turned their boats toward danger instead of away. Captain Sullenberger later said he didn't think of himself as a hero. He said he was just doing his job. But his job that day was to keep 155 people alive when both engines quit over New York City. And he did. The NTSB investigators called it the most successful ditching in aviation history. The media called it the miracle on the Hudson. The passengers just called it the day they should have died, and didn't. On January 15, 2009, a plane landed in the Hudson River, and everyone survived. That doesn't happen by accident.